Hi everyone, welcome back. We're still in the third section of the first handout. And thus far, this lecture has been fairly abstract, but now we're going to start encountering some concrete linguistic data. Some of the first pieces of data that we'll encounter will come from English. Throughout this course, I'll rely fairly heavily on English and German data, since these are languages which I know quite well. Maybe I'll pull in some Italian data, and I have data sets from a number of other languages which we'll use to illustrate interesting phenomena. Okay, so now for the rest of this lecture, what we're going to be doing is introducing the crucial analytical methods that can be applied for trying to discover the contrastive sounds of a language, departing from surface representations, from phonetic representations, and then how to properly write phonological processes, phonological rules to map from an underlying phonemic representation where we have some processes applying. Let's call them rule A and rule B, and then gradually, ultimately arriving to some surface representation. Okay, the first method that we'll talk about, which perhaps you have encountered in an introduction to linguistics generally, is the method of minimal pairs. And there are a few principles behind this method that I want to explain first of all. The first idea is that two sounds have to belong to two different phonemes. They have to be part of two different contrastive groups if there is a minimal pair that exists for them in the language. And here we'll define a minimal pair as a pair of words in a language that have different meanings and which are identical in their sequence of sounds, with the exception of one sound occurring at the same position in a word. So we can take a couple of English examples. The words side, seufzt, I can't say this word right now. English side and English ride, we can see that these words contain the same vowel, the same diphthong I, and they both end in a voiced alveolar stop. But the first sound beginning the word is different. In side, we have a voiceless coronal sibilant fricative, and at the beginning of ride, we have the English R sound, this rhotic approximant. And very often, it's possible, so those are the two sounds which we would say are contrastive, S and R. So the immediate conclusion to draw from this example is that the sounds R, and I need to transcribe that properly, the sounds, this rhotic approximant R and the sibilant fricative S, these belong to different phonemes. As I'll emphasize later on, this doesn't mean that the sounds S and R themselves should be chosen as the underlying representations. In this case, it's probably the case that in my variety of English, yes, there are underlying sounds, S and R, but the minimal pair itself doesn't establish this. We have to use some other methods, which we'll talk about in due course. And one can also find larger groups of words, any two of which can be said to constitute a minimal pair. So here let's take 4 words of German. So let's say we have Kasse and Gasse, or Kasse and Masse, or Kasse and Nasse. And any given pair of those, so at the beginning of Kasse, we have a voiceless velar fricative. At the beginning of Gasse, we have a voiced velar fricative. That shows us that those two sounds belong to two distinct phonemes. Similarly, our voiceless velar fricative at the left edge of Kasse builds a minimal pair with Masse, and so that that labial nasal must belong to a different phoneme than this voiceless velar stop. I think I may have been saying fricative. I meant stop here at the beginning of casa and gasa, of course. So let's look at one first example with a few words of English in one transcribed with the vowels that they have in my dialect. In most varieties of English, the consonants here are going to be basically the same, but other dialects might have slightly different vowels. Good. So let's try to find as many minimal pairs as possible, and I'll note the minimal pairs in a box over here as we find them. So let's start with suit over here. So suit, we want to see, so suit has a sibilant fricative at the beginning of the word, voiceless, and it contains the high back vowel oo and ends in a voiceless alveolar stop. So if any one of those sounds is different, but the other two remain the same, we then would have a minimal pair. So suit, we can say builds a minimal pair, for instance, with soot down here. So can I come back here? So it builds a minimal pair, for instance, with soot. Good. And do we have any other minimal pairs here? No. Oh, I see one typo here in boat. Sorry, boot. No, that's correct. Never mind. Right, we're still looking for minimal pairs with suit right now. So do we have anything? So boot, for instance, does build also a minimal pair with suit. In that case, the first consonant at the beginning of the word is different. So those two minimal pairs show us that, okay, the high back tense vowel oo and the high back lax vowel those two different vowels in suit and soot must belong to different phonemes, and also the voiceless sibilant alveolar fricative sa at the beginning of suit and the voiced labial stop at the beginning of boot. Those sounds must belong to different phonemes. So let's make that, let me close that. So let's express this generalization that we've just drawn over here. Okay, S and B belong to different phonemes. And also the vowels oo and similarly belong to different phonemes. In the interest of time, let's find just a couple other pairs here. So let's look at, say, put, for instance, right now. So let's go to put. And let's see. No. You'll often see me struggling to input the phonetic symbols properly. For the most part, I have key combinations on my computer memorized in order to input those symbols, but I may occasionally have to try to extract the symbols from elsewhere. Okay, let's look for a minimal pair that is built with the word put. So actually, the transcription here is wrong. There's the word put should have the same vowel as in soot. That's a mistake. Maybe in order to, we can see that, yeah, actually the mistake is in the English orthography there. That should read, let me correct that. Let me clear all of these drawings here and all of these drawings. So here, instead of put, this should read put. That would then be correct. So as the gloss there, we should read put with two T's, not a single T. I'll try to remember to, I'm going to highlight that for myself right now, and I'll try to correct that in the handout that gets uploaded that gets uploaded later. Good. So knowing that, we can still try to look for some minimal pairs. So minimal pairs here between put would also be but. So there we have a voiceless labial stop and a voiced labial stop. And do we have any other difference? So for instance, and then also of course put, there we have a different vowel. We have the same consonants in the word, but a different vowel. Here we have the central lax vowel in put, in contrast to the high back lax vowel in put. So similarly, now we can draw conclusions of a similar type, namely that the phones p and b belong to different phonemes, and the vowels and likewise belong to different phonemes. And let me emphasize here just again, so that we don't have any confusion whatsoever, that saying that these sounds belong to different phonemes, this applies only to English, and really only specifically to the variety of English being analyzed here. So for a different variety of English, these conclusions might not be valid, and they certainly wouldn't be valid in completely different languages. Okay, so now that we've discovered some minimal pairs, you might take the time at home to try to look for a few other minimal pairs. What's important to note here now is that a minimal pair alone is not sufficient to draw the conclusion that the phone which occurs in that word should be analyzed as the underlying phoneme. So the fact that we've found, for instance, in put and but, sorry, put and but, that doesn't tell us automatically that there should be underlying contrastive sounds in English, p and ba, which we would represent between slashes in this way. Finding a minimal pair merely establishes that the two phones that define the minimal pair belong to different phonemes, as I've been writing over here. And why is that? Well, it's because that the phone which occurs in a given word might best be derived by rule from an underlying sound which is different in some way. So in order to actually determine what the best underlying representation for a phoneme is, we have to employ a different method, namely the method of complementary distribution. Let me clear my writing now, and we can move on now to talking about complementary distributions. So complementary distribution as a technique is used to actually determine what the allophones of a phoneme are. And the principle here is that if two sounds occur in entirely separate environments, if they occur in totally different phonological contexts, then we can probably assume that they are indeed allophones of the same phoneme. So let's look at a little bit of data from the Hayes textbook, which looks at two different varieties of coronal nasal, an alveolar coronal nasal and a dental coronal nasal. So this is a fine point of transcription with the International Phonetic Alphabet. The sound transcribed with a normal letter N is a alveolar nasal, whereas the sound transcribed with this symbol underneath it, I'm going to copy it over here, with this extra symbol underneath it, is a dental nasal. So the position of the tongue is slightly different between these two sounds. And in my variety of English and most varieties of English, both sounds actually do occur. So we have words such as no, annoy, onion, and none, which contain the alveolar nasal, but the nasal in the words, there's another typo, it should read 10th. Let's annotate that and correct that. So that should read 10th, as in the ordinal number. 10th, in the words 10th, month, panther, and the flower chrysanthemum. Instead, there is a dental nasal, and in fact, it's almost an interdental nasal. Watch me pronounce, I'll move my mouth a bit closer to the camera and watch me as I read those words. 10th, month, panther, chrysanthemum. You may almost see my tongue protruding out from behind my upper teeth, whereas when I say no, annoy, onion, none, the group of sounds on the left side, you can't see my tongue whatsoever, because in the articulation along the alveolar ridge, you're not going to see my tongue whatsoever. Okay, so we can make two observations already with just this small set of data about the alveolar nasal and the dental nasal in English here. So the first is that, let me clear the word, let's clear the word 10th away. The first observation is that the alveolar nasal and the dental nasal are never found under identical conditions. So their distribution can be said to be complementary, and therefore we would conclude that the two sounds are allophones of the same phoneme. What is that distribution then exactly? So if we just look at the data on the right side, let's notice something here, namely that this dental nasal only occurs for the interdental fricative th, whereas we find the alveolar nasal at the beginning of a word, before a vowel, in the middle of the word, between vowels, after a vowel, and before the glide ya in the word onion, and also at the end of a word in the word none. We can describe those environments more precisely, but for present purposes, we don't need to. And that's exactly our second observation, namely that the dental nasal has a much more restricted range of occurrence than the alveolar nasal. So we find the alveolar nasal only before the interdental fricative th, whereas the coronal, we should say more precisely here that alveolar nasal, both the dental and the alveolar nasal are coronals. So let's read alveolar nasal here, saying that it occurs elsewhere. So in this sense, once we've made the first observation that we never find the alveolar nasal before the interdental fricative, but we never find the dental nasal, say at the beginning of a word or the end of the word, then we know that they should be said to be part of the same phoneme. So I'm going to start making a small diagram over here. You'll see many of these phoneme diagrams during this lecture. So here are our two. We have some phoneme here, and its allophones are down here. The question is what we want to choose to be that underlying phoneme and how we derive those two allophones. As we've said here, it looks like the alveolar nasal is what we would call the elsewhere allophone. It occurs in all contexts except before an interdental fricative, as in words like 10th, month, and panther. And analytically, it's always better, it's always more efficient to say that the elsewhere allophone constitutes the underlying representation for the phoneme. So this means we would want to choose as our underlying representation the alveolar nasal, or we can also draw the phoneme diagram. Let me try to draw this with some lines here. me try to write these symbols. So we have, now let's clear this. We have the underlying representation of an alveolar nasal, and it will be connected to two allophones. One of its allophones is identical to the underlying representation. It's also an alveolar nasal, and the other allophone will be the dental nasal, which we notate with this small bar underneath. So there we have our two allophones. Great. Okay. So now, what becomes tricky then is that to show that we now want to try to show that minimal pairs are indeed insufficient for establishing the underlying representation of a phoneme. That was a point we made earlier after we looked at our first group of minimal pairs here above. So let's consider a little bit of further data which contains the liquid sounds, the L, a couple of L sounds in English, what we sometimes refer to as a light L here and a dark L here. So the difference between these sounds is that the light L of English doesn't have any, the tongue body is not also against the velum, whereas with the dark L, the tongue body is also against a velum. So at the very beginning of a word or preceding a vowel, in English, we find the light L as in listen, lose, allow, aglow, and blend. But preceding another consonant, generally in English, we find the dark L, or at the end of a word. And even more specifically, when we put the this L sound, this lateral sound, before an interdental fricative, it also becomes dental. So it's no longer alveolar like the normal English light L, but it's both, it has a secondary velar articulation, and it becomes dental as well. So words such as wealth, health, filthy, tilth, and stealth. Tilth is probably not a very familiar word to many people, but for present purposes, it illustrates what's going on here. So again, let's look at the environments in which we find these two sounds, the regular alveolar liquid and the dark L with the tongue body against the velum, and but the tip of the tongue at a dental place of articulation. So these two sounds, we can see, have this basically the same distribution that our nasals did, right? So the dark L with dental place of articulation occurs only before the interdental fricative, whereas the other light alveolar L, I'm gonna note here that these two sounds are alveolar and dental, respectively. But what we can notice here is that the two sounds, each of the dental sounds would be in complementary distribution with each of the respective alveolar sounds. So there's a complementary distribution between the alveolar nasal and the dental lateral, and there's also a complementary distribution between the alveolar lateral and the dental nasal. So based on that complementary distribution, it's we have to look for some other minimal pairs then to try to decide, oh, what sounds have to belong to different phonemes. So let's take, for instance, the existing English word wealth, and I could invent an English word which would be written as when. It doesn't exist, but that would be a possible word of English. And if there were a word of English when, my perception would be that it would have to mean something different from the existing word wealth. So that tells me that this fake word when and the actually existing word wealth these constitute a minimal pair. So that indicates to us then that the dental nasal and the velarized, you can see the symbols are getting moved around a little bit here in an unhappy way, but the velarized the velarized dental lateral have to belong to different phonemes. When we have a minimal pair, then based on two sounds, those belong to different phonemes. So that shows us that even though the respective alveolar and dental sounds for both the lateral and the nasal are in complementary distribution with one another, and therefore it would be licit to try to say that they belong to the same phoneme. The method of minimal pairs tells us, oh, no, actually, the nasal and the lateral must belong to different phonemes, regardless of what allophones we're dealing with. We could also try to come up with a minimal pair at the beginning of a word. Say another minimal pair at the beginning of the word could be the English word lick and the personal name Nick. So there we can see the alveolar liquid and the alveolar nasal here building a minimal pair. So our overall conclusion should then be that our nasal and lateral belong to different phonemes. But both the nasal and the lateral have allophones which are similar in a crucial way, namely the nasal, which we decided that the underlying above, that the phoneme for the nasal should be posited to be underlyingly alveolar, but it has this dental allophone. And similarly, it looks like for the lateral, that the lateral has an underlying phoneme, which would be alveolar, but it has as one of its allophones, it has this velarized dental allophone. So this is a bit more complicated because this allophone changes more things than just becoming, than the tip of the tongue changing its place of articulation from alveolar to dental, but also the body of the tongue moves backwards to be in contact with the velum. Okay, so in the next video, we can move on to trying to explain the formation of those allophones with using some phonological rules.